The sun beat down on the empty stretch of desert road as Thomas guided his old pickup truck toward town that morning. And he had no idea his life was about to change in ways he never imagined at 62 years old. He'd been living alone on his ranch for 15 years now since Margaret passed, and the silence had become his companion, though not always a welcome one. The landscape stretched out before him, all red dust and scattered brush, with those distant mesas rising up like ancient guardians watching over the land, and Thomas found himself thinking about nothing in particular, which was how most of his days went these days. Then he saw something up ahead near the side of the road, and at first he thought it might be an animal, but as he got closer, his heart seized up in his chest because it was a person lying there in the dirt. Thomas pulled over fast, his tires kicking up dust, and he was out of the truck before the engine even stopped rumbling. She was young, maybe in her 20s, and she looked bad, real bad, with dirt caked on her face and what looked like blood on her clothes, and her breathing was shallow. "Miss, can you hear me?" Thomas said, kneeling down beside her, and his knees protested, but he ignored them. Her eyes fluttered open just barely, and they were dark and filled with pain and fear. "They left me," she whispered, and her voice was like dried leaves rustling. "Left me for the vultures." Thomas didn't waste time asking questions right then because he could see she needed help more than she needed to talk, and he was careful as he lifted her, though she was light as a child, and he carried her to his truck. The drive back to his ranch felt like it took forever, though it was only 20 minutes, and he kept glancing over at her, worried she might slip away right there in the passenger seat. But she held on. His ranch house wasn't much. Just a simple place with weathered wood and a porch that needed fixing. But it had running water and a bed, and right now that was what mattered. Thomas got her inside and laid her down on the guest bed, the one that hadn't been used since his daughter visited 3 years back. And then he set about doing what he could. He'd doctored plenty of animals in his time. And while people were different, the basics were the same, and he cleaned her wounds gentle as could be, and got some water into her, and covered her with blankets. She drifted in and out of consciousness that first day, and sometimes she would mumble things he couldn't understand, and other times she would just look at him with those eyes full of questions. By evening she was more alert, and Thomas brought her some warm broth he'd made from scratch the way Margaret used to make it. "What's your name?" he asked, sitting in the old chair beside the bed. "Maria," she said, and her voice was stronger now. "Maria Santos." "I'm Thomas Reed," he said, "and you're safe here, Maria." She looked at him for a long moment, and then tears started sliding down her cheeks, and Thomas felt his own throat tighten up, because he recognized that kind of crying, the kind that comes from holding too much inside for too long. Over the next few days, Maria got stronger, and she told him her story bit by bit. She'd been traveling with some people. She thought she could trust people who promised her work and a better life, and instead they'd robbed her and beaten her and left her out there to die. "I thought that was it," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I thought I was done, but you weren't," Thomas said. "You held on. Because of you," Maria said, looking at him with gratitude that made him uncomfortable in the way kindness sometimes does when you're not used to receiving it. Thomas shook his head. "I just did what any decent person would do." But Maria smiled a little. Not everyone would have stopped Thomas, and you know that. He did know that, and it made him sad to admit it, but he also knew she was right. As the weeks passed, Maria healed, and she insisted on helping around the ranch even though Thomas told her she didn't have to. She had a way with the horses that surprised him, and she could cook better than he ever could, and suddenly the ranch house didn't feel so empty anymore. They fell into a rhythm that felt natural, like they'd known each other for years instead of weeks. And Thomas found himself talking about things he hadn't talked about in a long time. He told her about Margaret, about their 40 years together, and how she died suddenly one spring morning, and how he'd felt lost ever since. Maria listened the way few people know how to listen anymore, with her whole attention, and without trying to fix things or offer empty platitudes. "She sounds like she was wonderful," Maria said one night as they sat by the fireplace because the desert got cold at night. "She was," Thomas said, "and I miss her every single day." Maria nodded. "I lost my mother 5 years ago, and I still reach for the phone sometimes to call her before I remember." They sat in comfortable silence after that, and Thomas realized this was something he'd been missing more than he knew. Just having someone there to share the quiet moments with. Maria told him about her life too, about growing up in a small village, about her dreams of making something of herself, and how she'd made some bad choices along the way. "I should have known better," she said with regret in her voice. "We all make mistakes." Thomas said, "What matters is what we do after." One afternoon, about a month after he'd found her, Maria came to him with determination in her eyes. "I need to figure out what I'm going to do," she said. "I can't stay here forever." Thomas felt something drop in his chest because he'd gotten used to having her around, but he understood. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't have much money, and I don't have family here." Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking, and then he said, "What if you stayed?" Maria looked at him surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, stay here." Thomas said, "I could use help with the ranch, and you've been doing a fine job already, and there's plenty of room." "Thomas, I couldn't." Maria started, but he held up his hand. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "I'm offering honest work and a place to live, and maybe something else too." "What's that?" she asked. "Companionship," Thomas said simply. "Turns out I was lonelier than I wanted to admit." Maria's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different tears. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I'm sure," Thomas said, and he meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. So Maria stayed, and as the months went by, the ranch came back to life in ways Thomas hadn't expected. They fixed up the old barn together and got some chickens and planted a vegetable garden that Margaret would have loved. The neighbors started noticing the changes, and some of them stopped by, curious about the young woman living at Thomas Reed's place. Thomas introduced Maria as his helper and friend, and he could see some of them judging, but he didn't care because he knew the truth of it. And that was enough. Maria taught him things too, like how to make proper tortillas from scratch and some Spanish words, and she got him to laugh more than he had in years. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching another sunset, Thomas said, "You know, when I found you that day, I thought I was just helping someone in need." "You were," Maria said, "but you helped me too." Thomas continued, "More than you know, and I want you to understand that this place is your home now for as long as you want it to be." Maria reached over and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Thomas, for seeing me when I was invisible, for stopping when others would have driven by. Thank you for trusting me," Thomas said, "for staying and for reminding me that life isn't over just because you're getting older." They sat there as the stars started coming out one by one, and Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. He felt like he had family again. It wasn't the same as what he'd had with Margaret. Nothing ever would be, but it was its own kind of good, and that was more than enough. The desert wind blew gentle across the land, carrying the scent of sage and dust and possibilities. Thomas thought about how strange life was, how you could go along thinking you knew how things would be, and then everything could change, because you decided to stop your truck and help a stranger. He thought about all the people who probably drove past Maria that day, who looked the other way or didn't see her at all, and he was grateful that something made him stop. Maybe it was Margaret watching over him, or maybe it was just dumb luck, but either way he was thankful. "You know what Margaret used to say?" Thomas said, breaking the comfortable silence. "What's that?" Maria asked. "She used to say that kindness is never wasted, even when it seems small." Thomas said, "She said every act of kindness ripples out in ways we can't see." Maria smiled. She was a wise woman. That she was, Thomas agreed. They sat there a while longer, neither of them needing to say anything more because some things don't need words. The ranch house glowed warm with light behind them, and the horses nickered softly in the barn, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the moon. Thomas looked over at Maria and saw her profile outlined against the darkening sky, and he thought about how fragile life was, how quickly things could change. She could have died out there in that desert dust, and he would have driven past never knowing, and his life would have continued on in its quiet, lonely way, but she didn't die, and he did stop, and now here they were, two people who needed each other in ways neither of them had quite understood until it happened. I think I'll make that apple pie tomorrow, Maria said. The one you said Margaret used. To make... I'd like that, Thomas said, and his voice was thick with emotion, as they finally got up to go inside. Thomas paused and looked out at his land stretching into the darkness. This was his home, the place where he'd built a L.